Bonjour, everybody. Niigaan Sinclair, I'm Indigenous costs. My name is Niigaan. Nice to see everybody. Welcome to part 4, Niwin, of our workshop. I just wanted to show you a few things before we get started here. I'm a writer now, and I'd say most of my living is made off of my writing as a professor or as a person who writes for the newspaper at the Winnipeg Free Press. There's lots of different elements that I've been writing on, and there's lots of places that you can write. I've even put together an anthology right here called Manitowapow, which has writings in Manitoba, Indigenous writings going back hundreds of years, starting with the very first speeches that were recorded of Indigenous peoples, going all the way back to Chief Peguis, all the way back in the 18th century. And you can even see here that our people have been writing for a very long period of time, whether that be in syllabics or in our beadwork or in our different images of Manitowapow, the rock formations in Manitoba. And so part of the work that I've done, and this is my publisher right here, which is HighWater Press, is we are interested in hearing your story. And so our publisher is always very interested in hearing the stories of Indigenous peoples, particularly young Indigenous peoples, because it's stories that most often haven't been heard. And so your story is valuable, and there are lots of venues for which to do it. This is my very first published poem that I wrote called The New Act, which was way back in 2001. I know some of you might not have even been born in those days, but this was an anthology called Prairie Fire, and this is a more updated version. I still write stories and different pieces, nonfiction, some fiction pieces in this. This is the new Prairie Fire. You can take a look. They most often do Indigenous anthologies. This is an anthology edited by Warren Carreau, who's a Métis writer, and Katarina Vermette, who's another Métis writer, both award-winning writers doing great work in Indigenous literature. But sometimes, nonfiction is not, it's not sexy stories about yourself. It's sometimes stories about other people's work. And so this was a Literary Review of Canada. This is a piece that I wrote about another person's book. It's a review of their book, but it's also a review of my experience reading the book. And so it's really a story about my own experience. And sometimes different anthologies will come up and available. This was an anthology that the Indigenous Writers Collective of Manitoba put together a number of years ago about love and if you get a chance to hear about an anthology, apply for it, or hear about a magazine that's interested in your work. Sometimes you get opportunities to write, pieces for books that you're asked to. This was a James Dashik's anniversary book, and you can see I wrote the foreword to it. One of the very early parts. And so what I wrote is I wrote a piece really about my experience, about hearing some of the stories that are within this book. And so very much nonfiction, as like I told you before, is the most read fiction in the world. And let's get started on the workshop. And now bringing your story, you've edited it, you've now been working on it, you've refined it, you've cut, you've trimmed, you are now ready to send it out into the world. And here we are right here. Now, once again, this workshop is in the Create to Learn series. And it's in the sponsored by Taking It Global, and it's in partnership with Imaginative. And it's how to write and share your story, creative nonfiction. It's part Niwin, the final part of our series. And so I invite you to comment and share and use the hashtag Create to Learn as we begin to finish off this workshop. I really love to see your pieces. I'm going to give you some ideas on how to publish them and where to send them and that kind of thing. And maybe you also create an anthology in your community, or maybe with other people, maybe you have a writers collective within your community that you then create an anthology, whatever that might look like. But send it to me, or send me some ideas that you've been working on. And so my handle is on Twitter, and that's Niigaan Sinclair, and on Instagram, it's also Niigaan Sinclair. But if you go on Facebook, my name, Niigaan James Sinclair, I have a writer page. I also have an individual page. Check me out, check out some of the writings. I always post my writings on my writer page, particularly with my column with the Winnipeg Free Press, and sometimes my other pieces as well. I'm on a lot of media. Sometimes I'm on CBC or on CTV or APTN or whatever that might be. And so I post a lot of that stuff as well there. This workshop's in 4 parts. We've gone through part B Chic, which is what is your story, Niige, creating your story, Nisui, recreating your story or editing your story, and then finally Niwin, which is publishing your story. So here we are. We have arrived. We have arrived to now your story is ready, refined, and you're thinking about where it's going to go. And the first thing what you want to do is you want to say to yourself, okay, here I am. I've gone on this journey. I had started out with my 5 events, then I created a first line for each event, and then I began to write the story for that event, and then I handed it to my refrigerator love, and then I handed it to my professional love, and then I began to refine it and cut and trim, and you got all that feedback, and now you've been working. You've got all these versions saved on your story. Don't ever give up on those versions, because you'll never know when they become stories onto itself. The writer Gerald Visner often writes the same story, or what sounds like the same story, in multiple different places, but it looks different. And so I would think sometimes he saves versions of stories, then goes back to those versions and then reworks them, and then publishes what looks like a similar story, but done in a different way. And you'll see a lot of our storytellers will do that, particularly when they're telling our creation story, because it's meant to sound the same, but always be placed in a location and a time. Now, before you publish your story, here are some questions to ask yourself. Is your work really complete, or have you just run out of time? The thing that I most often happens with me is I just run out of time. And that means that you have to make a decision. Is the story going to be published or not? And the really big thing is you want to ask yourself, is this something I'm going to be proud of? Because it's like an arrow shooting itself into the sky. You can never get it back. You can never get that story back. So are you ready for it to be in publication? Are you ready for other people to read it? Are you ready for other people to think that's your work and to define you according to that work? Are there any elements that might be time sensitive? And so I have a lot of this, as a column writer, I often have experiences where I'm thinking, this piece will not live beyond this week. It involves a really specific event happening this week. For instance, I wrote a lot about the Jody Wilson-Raybould being kicked out of the cabinet by Prime Minister Trudeau. And those pieces have not aged particularly well because they were really in a specific time period. You want to ask yourself, okay, is this a piece that needs to be published now? And no matter what shape it's in, and that may force you to publish it anyways, or is it a piece that maybe can work a few more weeks, or maybe it's not quite ready for this anthology, so you have to, send a kind and very regretful email to the editor to say it's not quite ready, and maybe can I have more time, or maybe there's not enough time, and then maybe you have to be dropped out of the project, and that's not the end of the world. That's not the end of the world. The other thing you want to ask yourself is, what genre is it? Because then you might ask yourself, okay, where is it going to live? Is it in a magazine or a journal or a newspaper, maybe a newsletter in your community? Does it need other elements? Does it maybe need a photograph, or does it need a photograph of you? Or what I would say is, always have a short bio ready and a professional photograph. And you don't need a professional photograph because these days we all have smartphones. So that means that you probably have photographs that you can use, but you always have to have the rights to that photograph. Don't use a photograph that someone else has taken of you, because you never know if that person has given you the permission to use it. And that's where this big question of, when you're writing a nonfiction story, you're most often talking about real people. Therefore, if you're going to talk about real people, you must ask permission for them to appear in your story. If you've written it and you plan to publish it, that person may not be ready to hear the story that you tell about them. It might be a perspective, or it might not be the fullest perspective. So you want to make sure that you don't embarrass anybody with your piece. And, particularly in small communities, you want to make sure that you ask elders if there's anything that's been shared with you that shouldn't be written down, especially songs and ceremonies and things like that. Make sure that you assert and that you get all the permissions necessary for a story to be shared about your experience. And what I always tell students is, if you're ever going to write about something sacred, something's been shared with you that's very personal, or that involves a ceremony, or say a sweat lodge, or something that involves a song that's being shared for a long period of time, maybe those things are not to be written down. And so it's important to ask a community or ask an elder to say, and be prepared for them to say, no, that isn't to be written down. I don't want that to be shared with the community. I don't want that appearing in a story. As writers, as Indigenous writers, I think one thing that we do that's really important is we have an ethic that we still have to live in those communities. Therefore, you have a responsibility to those people who you are often related to, or friends with, or living with forever. And you want to live respectfully. You want to live in a gift-giving way. You want to live in a kind way. And so that's what our teachings are all about. So as a storyteller, you want to make sure that the story that you share out there is a story that's respectful. And so make sure that you've got those permissions as well. Now, there's many places that your writing can live. There's hundreds of magazines and e-zines. I've shown you a few of them, the websites, and there's lots of places in cities, particularly where there's literary journals. There's also lots of places at post-secondary institutions, lots of places in communities. Usually small newspapers are always looking for writers to be able to write creatively about experiences in the community, or the experiences at the fair, or the treaty days, or experiences, maybe an experience during the birth of your niece or your nephew, or maybe an experience about seeing something for the first time or hearing the drum for the first time. There's always places to publish your work. And one of the most important places to go is go to any store or a bookstore, or sometimes just a gas station, and just look through the magazines and say to yourself, okay, well, where would be a place that this writing might exist? Look through the newspaper and say, if this is a piece really about a particular issue, does this newspaper does this paper need to hear about this issue? And would it help, from my perspective, to be in that newspaper? This is where self-publication might be your best friend. As a beginning writer, self-publication is probably the best venue for you, because you can publish for free online anytime. As differently than when I was in university, there wasn't a lot of places to publish online. There certainly wasn't a lot of blogs in the early days of when I was in university. And nowadays, there's blogs everywhere. There's places that you can get access to publishing your work. And you might even choose to make a website for yourself and then publish a story every day, or every couple days, or one every week. And you'll start to create a following, and then use your social media and you'll post links to those. That's where you can begin to create a following for your work. And that's what will begin to create a buzz and an interest in what you have to say. And then what will happen is you'll get an email from someone who will commission you to write something. It might be on the Winnipeg Free Press, for example, saying, hey, can you write about the experience on your grandfather's trapline that you wrote a story about? Or maybe tell us about the ice fishing trip that you went on, or tell us about that experience beadworking with your granny, or whatever that might be. You'll get commissioned eventually. And so people will begin to ask you more and more, hey, what do you think about this? Or, hey, could you share this story? But maybe self-publication might be something that you do within your community. Maybe self-publication might involve something where you, instead of putting it online, maybe you're not comfortable with that. Maybe you just want to make a small anthology for your family. One of the very first things I ever did was take all my poetry together, and I gave it to my grandmother, and then I gave it to my mother, and I also gave one to my father. And nowadays I'm kind of embarrassed about that poetry, but it was a real important moment for me as a writer to be able to make an anthology of my own work and then hand it to people who I care about. And I know that they weren't going to go out and, judge me too much, or they weren't going to, when I went through my grandmother's, my grandmother passed away recently. I was going through some of her items, and I found my original anthology that I had given to her. And I noticed that all these pages had been rabbit-eared, had been folded. And so clearly there were certain poems that she really liked. And there were poems most often talking about myself and my own identity and my own ideas. And it's pretty remarkable that you're able to experience, something that you're able to publish and then hand to people in a really honest and giving way. They make incredible gifts too, if you're ever looking for gifts at holidays. Professional publications, though, if that's what your venue is, if you want to become a professional writer and start getting paid at some point for your work, it's going to be a long journey. It's not something that happens overnight. You're going to have to find out some research and some locations and write a cover letter. There's lots of different websites that can help you to be able to formulate yourself as a professional writer. The most important thing is a cover letter, which will tell people a little bit about yourself, any previous publications, and then also say if you want any comments or criticism, but don't expect any of that. And most oftentimes as a first-time writer, you might not be offered, you might be publishing in journals that might not give you a lot of money. It might be $50, or it might be a small amount of money, $75 for a poem or a piece. And frankly, as a freelance writer, anyone will tell you that you don't make a lot of money as a freelance writer. What you hope is that a freelance gig will lead to a regular gig where you'll be hired by a newspaper or a journal, or you'll be hired by someone in order to write regularly. Maybe a publisher who asks you to be able to create pieces regularly for an anthology series that they have, or whatever that might be. Being a writer is not a glamorous life. There are very few people who make a living at writing. I only know 2 in my entire network of writing. I know, a few hundred writers, and I really only know a couple that can make a living off their writing. Most people have to have a full-time job, or they have to have some kind of job in which that involves writing or editing or so on. Maybe they work for an NGO and they edit newsletters in the daytime, or they work on small projects for an organization, and then they also write on the weekends and they publish their pieces. Be patient. There's many more writers than there are publishers and editors. So when you send that piece off, email that piece off with your cover letter to the magazine or the newspaper or the book or publisher, or whoever you're sending it to, the editor. Wait a little bit, but then also be consistent. Send an email a couple weeks after that and say, hey, I just sent you that piece, wondering if you had any thoughts about it, or appreciate you accepting or considering it, and always be humble. Don't double submit. That's the #1 rule of writing. Don't take the same piece and submit it to 2 places, because they both accept it. You can't both have it appear, because writers or editors really don't like that, because they want to be known as having that piece within their anthology. Because why would they buy their anthology if you can get it from over here? Be ready for more rejection than acceptance. And that's just the reality of being a writer. I have probably 500 pieces that I've written on my computer today. And less than half have ever been published, even less in terms of my creative work, in terms of my short stories and things like that. Be ready for a lot more rejection than acceptance. And here you are, we have arrived. Congrats. Nishin, Nishin, Nishin. Welcome to the life of a writer. I've only touched upon a few of these issues of publishing stories and nonfiction. So if it's something you want to know more about, then just email me or send me a message, or take a look at this meme. Not every day is going to be the most glamorous as a writer. Some days are going to be really frantic, and some days are going to be frustrating, and some days are going to be exciting, and some days your own writing is going to make you cry, and sometimes they're going to make you laugh, and sometimes they're going to just want to make you throw your computer across the room, or your pen across the room, or whatever that might be. But keep at it. Writing is an incredibly rewarding profession. It is something that I love. It's something that I love being a part of. I love being with other writers. I love experiencing writing. I love seeing my work out there. I also like looking back at my writing and think about how much I've grown. And also sometimes being very proud, and sometimes being a little bit embarrassed of the pieces that I've written. But knowing that for generations to come, people who come after me will be able to access things that I thought about and that I said, and even own, Anishinaabeg, who can look into the future and look back and see what Anishinaabe were thinking about for today, and what Indigenous peoples were, writing about and reflecting about. I hope all of you keep in touch. It's been a real wonderful opportunity for me to do this workshop. This is my email. Like I said before, you can reach me on Twitter. You can also reach me on Instagram. Reach out to me. Send me a message on my author page on Facebook, Niigaan James Sinclair. Let me know how you are as a writer, or if you have any ideas of where to publish, or if you even have a place that's looking for a writer. I'm interested, or I will know people who are interested, and I have lots of access to people who are trying to become writers as well. And it's been a real honor to be able to share this space with you. I say huge miigwech to the Create to Learn people who sponsored by Taking It Global, and giving us this opportunity to be able to share this space of creativity and work together. So what a wonderful 4-part series workshop this was. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech for all of this time, and I really look forward to seeing all the pieces that you create. Take care of yourself, and I will see you out there in the writerly world.